you might be new here, none of us can work without Mary. I would also like to welcome the participants and the general audience to the first Telos conference on asymmetrical warfare. And as you have probably already observed, hopefully in the conference program, we have two distinguished keynote speakers this year, as well as what I consider to be sort of rather intriguing papers by scholars across the country and also internationally. We expect their challenging arguments, and I think the diverse opinions that they express will be a sort of very promising manifestation of the hard-hitting, critical spirit that has always characterized Telos here. Now, some of you no doubt have wondered, you saw the initial advertisement for this year's program, what asymmetrical warfare has to do with the Telos tradition of critical theory. Yes? Well, I hope that as the Congress progresses, or the conference progresses, this question will be answered in a very positive manner. We consider this question of the relationship between the political aspects of asymmetrical warfare and the American public to be of such importance that we actually intend that this will be just the first conference of several on this subject. And we're planning to pursue this in the future. Now, we're very fortunate to open our conference with a keynote presentation from Dr. Stephen Metz. And Dr. Metz is a very distinguished scholar in his field, as well as someone with extensive active experience in intelligence matters. A prolific author, he has published widely in academic journals and those oriented towards national security policy. He has particular expertise in counterinsurgency. His books include a study of Iraq and the evolution of American strategy. He has been an advisor to political campaigns and the intelligence community generally. He has been on the faculty of the Air War College and the U.S. Army Command General Staff College. He is currently Director of Research at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. This morning, Dr. Metz will no doubt challenge many of our preconceptions with his talk on future conflict and the conceptual prism of asymmetry. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Stephen Metz.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take out my cell phone now, but I need kind of a disclaimer there. I'm kind of an obsessive tweeter, but I'm not going to be live tweeting my own talk. My watch is broken. I literally need that so I can keep an eye on the time. So.
But did you silence it?
I did silence it.
Okay.
I actually did. I'm one of those people that always gives the dirty look to the person whose cell phone goes off. I did notice, I had two daughters, and we were doing college visits. I actually counted, and between the two of them, I think we did 19 college visits, and there were 0 times that somebody's cell phone didn't go off during the talk. So yeah, I'm crazy about that. It is a great pleasure to be here today. I have to admit to you that when I got the invitation to this, I don't know, 6-8 months ago, I didn't know a lot about the Institute. So, as I did some research on it and learned a little more, the more interesting and enticing I found it. So it really is a singular honor to be able to talk to you today. The title for my talk is Future Conflict in the Conceptual Prism of Asymmetry. It's kind of a complex title, but I did it very deliberately. And hopefully, as my talk progresses today, I'll kind of unpack that, because there are kind of multiple themes that I put together into that title. But I'd also like to give you just a little bit of context about why I'm here talking to you about this specific topic. So, I want to do just kind of a couple of minutes about my career and how I ended up, what led me to this place talking to you about this today. I began life just as a college professor focusing on international relations, comparative politics, political sociology, Tim Luke, who I think was my colleague in my first and only academic job. So I began life that way, and I almost by accident stumbled into the U.S. military's professional education system. And it was kind of an eye-opener to me because I had no military background. I didn't know much about the military. I mean, I didn't even know there was a professional military education system. But I've spent my career in it since then and have been really amazed over the years at just what an elaborate, careful, and rigorous system of education the U.S. military has. I mean, what I've heard, I've never checked the date on this, but I've heard a number of times that a career U.S. military officer actually spends more time in the classroom than any other professional in the United States. I mean, that includes lawyers, doctors, or whatever, because they, not only do they start off with a college degree, the vast majority will get at least a master's degree, many have multiple master's degrees, but there is this whole gradation and level of military education, and it becomes increasingly selective, increasingly theoretical, increasingly conceptual as you move along. So as Joe mentioned, I actually began my career at what the military calls the staff college level, where the students are people who have been in the military 12 to 14 years. In military terms, they're captains or the Navy equivalent. But since 1991, I've been at the war college level, first teaching and then in a research position. The war colleges are the real elite of the military. The Army War College where I work now is an accredited master's degree granting institution. We're actually getting an accredited PhD program soon. But from having spent my career as an academic and as a civilian inside the military education system, it's really given me kind of a unique perspective on the U.S. military and on security in general. Because what it's given me is kind of an insider's view. I mean, most of my colleagues are military officers or retired military officers, but I think I still have some of the outsider's detachment. It's one of those, it's like moving to another country and another culture where, if you moved to the United States from somewhere else and been here for a long time, you kind of understand the U.S., but you have a different perspective on it because in a way you belong and don't belong at the same time. And I think that I've been able to kind of have that perspective on the military. And being a civilian in a military academic situation has also allowed me to be sort of a contrarian, which is part of my nature. So as my talks develop today, what I'm going to try to do is to weave in a perspective that explains how the U.S. military, defense civilians, and the wider community of people that shape ideas of American defense. I mean, people that work in think tanks and elsewhere in Washington that kind of move in and out of policy positions. I think I can give you a perspective on how they see global security, how they see America's role and things like that. But I can also do it from a critical perspective because I'm inside and outside at the same time. So against that backdrop, my talk today is going to have three major components. I'll kind of give you a preview of coming attractions here. The first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this concept of asymmetry. Because if you say that to somebody in the military or somebody, a civilian in the Pentagon or somebody in one of the Washington think tanks, it means something very particular, which certainly overlaps with the way it might be seen in the scholarly or wider intellectual community, but there are some distinctions as well. So I want to try to explain the way the military, the Department of Defense, sees asymmetry, what they mean by that. Second of all, I'm going to do just a little bit of speculation on what I see as the meta trends in future conflict. I mean, as I've kind of carved out my role over the last 15 or 20 years, and if you ask me what my intellectual specialties are, counterinsurgency is certainly one of them, but I also describe myself as a strategic futurist. Kind of looking at the evolution of conflict, what armed conflict might be like in 10 or 20 years, And just as an illustration to that, I literally just in the past couple of weeks began work on a book that I hope to have finished in a year or two called War in an Age of Robots, where I'm going to be looking at this idea of how armed conflict is changing as we see the emergence of autonomous systems and things like that. So I'm going to talk about asymmetry, talk a little bit, just briefly about what I see as the meta trends in armed conflict, and then try to tie the two together. Specifically, what I'm going to do is to suggest that the trends in the global security system indicate that U.S. military and U.S. defense policymakers may be approaching the world with some faulty assumptions. And that's where I get back to this idea of a conceptual prison. I think we're at a point where to be successful in the future as the global security environment changes, policymakers, aided by academics and intellectuals of all kinds, need to break out of this conceptual prison and begin to think a little differently about not only asymmetry, but security writ large. Okay, let me start with the concept of asymmetry. Okay, asymmetry first entered the lexicon of the U.S. military and defense policymakers in the 1990s. What was going on in the 1990s is the military was just coming off Operation Desert Storm, the military operation that crushed Saddam Hussein's military in Kuwait and Iraq. And so there was a lot of thinking in terms of trying to figure out what this meant, what lessons could be drawn, what that said about the nature of military force in the future. And of course, if you remember back, this was also a time where the U.S. was doing kind of a broader rethinking or reevaluation of the role of American military power and of America's role in the world. I mean, it was the end of the Cold War, so you had people in the military, defense policymakers, that were trying to say to themselves, okay, what do we want to do with the U.S. military in this new world that's very different than the one everyone making decisions at the time grew up in, and how are we going to do it? What came out of this thinking in the early to mid-90s is a concept that the military called the revolution in military affairs. And in real short order, there basically a number of people inside the military said, when you look back in the history of armed conflict, in military history, there have been a number of times throughout history that a number of things came together, technology, new ideas, new operational methods that allow some sort of revolutionary improvement in the effectiveness of military forces. The thinking at the time was basically nations or states that capitalized on these revolutions, that understood them, took advantage of them, got some sort of strategic and political benefit. Therefore, the conclusion was that the United States, even though it was far and away the predominant military power in the world, again, mid-1990s, the United States needed to think this through lest someone else kind of steal a march on it, that some other state, nation, whatever, would understand this ongoing revolution better and would gain advantage from it. Specifically, the way the military defense policymakers saw this revolution of the 1990s was as a technology-driven one. Do you guys in the back want to grab a seat? I'm going to hurt my feelings. The belief was that there was new technology that was coming on board, that we just saw a little hint of it in Desert Storm, that would greatly expand the precision of military strikes. And it would greatly expand the ability of the military to precisely strike targets from long distances. So politically, what that meant to defense policymakers in the military was that the U.S. military, if it exploited this revolution, was going to be able to preserve the political utility of military force in a time after the Cold War when the U.S. no longer faced an existential threat or great power. In other words, military leaders and political leaders were saying, given that we don't have, we can't go to the American public and say, here's the Soviet Union that's going to take us over if we don't spend a lot on defense, and and if your sons don't go into the military. Since that didn't work anymore, what political leaders needed to do was to go to the public and say, well, we can use military force at a fairly low cost, at least to Americans and to non-combatants. Still kill a lot of enemies, but this precision, this perfect picture of the battlefield that technology was going to allow us would make military force sustain its utility. The primary source of this original thinking about the revolution in military affairs was a fairly small organization in the Pentagon called the Office of Net Assessment, led by a kind of a legendary man named Andrew Marshall, who just like recently retired in his 90s. I mean, he was like running this office up until about a year and a half ago, and he was a Nixon appointment. But the Office of Net Assessment kind of pushed this. But this idea of a revolution in military affairs was embraced by the military, was embraced by the defense industry that wanted to be able to sell stuff to the government with the Cold War over, and was also embraced by the wider community of people that influence the way the U.S. thinks about defense, think tanks, academics, and so forth. But just as all of this enthusiasm for the revolution in military affairs was taking off, there were other people in the community saying, not so fast. That all of this high technology, precision, lifting the fog of war, perfect view of the battlefield stuff is good, but we can't assume that future enemies will be as stupid as Saddam Hussein. I mean, Saddam Hussein in a lot of ways was the perfect enemy because he used big Soviet-style conventional military formations that we could see and destroy from afar. But he did it without Soviet quantities, without Soviet air power, without Soviet surveillance systems, without nuclear weapons. So, if in 1990, 1991, you had wanted to sit down and draw a perfect enemy for the U.S. military to fight and do well against, I mean, Saddam Hussein was it. But there were people within the community saying, future enemies are not going to be that stupid. They're going to be smart enough to understand what the U.S. military is really good at, which is using high technology means to find things and strike at them from afar. So this kind of little group of nonconformists was saying, most likely the future adversaries that the U.S. faces will not be big Soviet-style conventional military formations, but will be ones that will use asymmetric methods. We use things like terrorism, we use things like insurgency that will disperse and hide among non-combatants. Will use the U.S.'s self-imposed constraints, its value system, its laws against them. So because of that, at the same time that there was this great enthusiasm for the high-tech revolution in military affairs, there were other people saying we also need to think about how an adversary might counter the United States asymmetrically. So that sort of unleashed a good bit of thinking within the military and within the defense community on what asymmetry meant. I mean, in simplest terms, asymmetry in military affairs, or asymmetry in security, simply means acting, organizing, thinking different than opponents in order to maximize your own advantages and to exploit the enemy's shortcomings or weaknesses. So it's a way to use a difference against an opponent. Now, when I first kind of heard this talk about asymmetry coming from within the Pentagon, it made good sense to me. I'm someone who at that point in time in my career had spent a lot of time looking particularly at insurgency, so I was kind of inherently comfortable with this notion of asymmetry. But I said, the concept really needs kind of expansion and broadening. I mean, to say that enemies will do things asymmetrically, while it kind of, it's kind of what the military calls a blinding flash of the obvious. It makes sense, but it doesn't really tell you a lot. So one thing I did at that point in the 1990s was I undertook kind of a history-based analysis of asymmetry in warfare, asymmetry in armed conflicts. In this study, which by the way, is on the Strategic Studies Institute's webpage if you have any interest in it. In this analysis, I reached a couple of conclusions that I think still hold today. And one of these is that in warfare, in armed conflict, asymmetry has multiple different dimensions. It's not just technology, but asymmetry can be what I call positive or negative. In other words, you can be different than your opponent. That can be a good thing for you, it can be a bad thing. Asymmetry can be deliberate or accidental. I mean, back in the times of colonial expansion, when you had conventional European militaries fighting against, trying to pacify new colonies, they were fighting against guerrillas and raiders and so forth that were fighting them asymmetrically, but not because they sat down and said, well, you know, we need to counter the British and the French asymmetrically. It's because they were, you know, tribesmen or whatever. That's simply the way they knew how to fight. That's the way their ancestors had always fought. So it was asymmetry, but it was not deliberate. It was accidental or inadvertent asymmetry. Asymmetry can be short-term or long-term. It can be high risk or low risk. It can be what I call discrete or integrated. And what I mean by that is a discrete asymmetry would be if that's your primary thing, if you are fighting someone else, and asymmetric methods are what you focus on the most. Integrated asymmetry can be, you're not intentionally trying to be asymmetric, but it's integrated within it. And maybe most interesting to me is it can be physical or psychological. I mean, I'm somebody that my entire career I've particularly been interested in the psychology of conflict. And it did strike me that there are, you know, when the U.S. uses advanced technologies, you know, that would be a physical type of asymmetry. When a terrorist uses a car bomb, that's a psychological form of asymmetry. So there are multiple dimensions of asymmetry. But there are also multiple types of asymmetry. And just to kind of tick off the list that I came up with in this study, there are asymmetries of method, there are asymmetries of will, the idea that we'll stick to this, we'll pay a greater cost than our opponents. So that's an asymmetry of will. There's an asymmetry of morale. There are ethical asymmetries, that one side is willing to do things that the other won't. There certainly are asymmetries of technology. There are asymmetries of organization. You know, when the U.S. was fighting the insurgents in Iraq from 2003 up to around 2010, they were organized in small groups that swarmed on a target versus the more hierarchical American-style organization. And there certainly are asymmetries of patience. And this is something that I found very important writing for particularly an American military audience, the idea that we might face an enemy that's simply willing to persist in a conflict longer than we are. So there are different dimensions, different types of asymmetry. Now, when I came out with this study, the people in the U.S. military came to me and said, okay, so we got all that, but tell us what it means. Which asymmetries are the kind that we need? Which are the ones that work and which are the ones that don't? And I said, well, you're not going to like my answer, but unfortunately, it depends. There are no ironclad rules. There are certain types of asymmetry that work under some conditions and not under others. There are certain types of asymmetries that work for a while and don't work over a long period of time. The strategic theorist Edward Woodcock wrote a book called Strategy a number of years ago, in which he laid out what he called the paradoxical logic of strategy. And part of the paradoxical logic is what works today may not work or probably won't work tomorrow as enemies adapt to it. So some asymmetric methods work for a while and then their utility declines. And I mean, the Iraq insurgency from 2003 to 2010 is a perfect example of that. After a few years, things that worked in 2003, 2004, 2005 no longer work. So that kind of frustrated people in the military because what they want is a rule. It's kind of like, okay, Metz, tell us what the rule is so that we can kind of go out and do it. But I said, the rule is there are no rules. It's kind of like the first rule of the Fight Club is to never mention the Fight Club. Well, the first rule is that there are no rules. And another important implication of this, and I think this is one that's really important, is that this variation makes conflict a realm where creativity and the speed of adaptation matters greatly. I mean, I've argued over and over again that particularly in this environment, in today's security environment, an organization, whether it's a state or a non-state actor, that's able to adapt the most quickly gains big advantages. The speed of adaptation. And that's something that really, kind of stymies the U.S. military, because being this huge, massive, kind kind of ironclad bureaucracy. Adaptation for a long time wasn't something it was really good at, but in Iraq at least, it really did make tremendous efforts to get better at changing and adapting. But I think that what I was saying about asymmetry in the 1990s is going to become even more true in the future, in that the advantage goes to those who learn, who can be creative, and who adapt the fastest. Okay, so that's kind of where we were in the 1990s. Of course, asymmetry wasn't invented in the 1990s. I mean, it had been around for a long time. Certainly the 1960s and 1950s, with the rise of Maoist-style insurgency, was a time when asymmetry was really important. But the warnings of the 1990s certainly have come to pass since 9/11. Because what we've seen over the past 16, coming up on 17 years, is that conventional warfare, the way it's existed for at least the past 500 years, has become less common and less strategically significant as asymmetric conflict has become more strategically significant. I mean, an argument that I've been making for a number of years is there's always been asymmetric conflict. I mean, as long as there have been kind of advanced states and less advanced political entities, asymmetry has been around for as long as there's been armed conflict. But it ebbs and flows in strategic significance. I mean, go back to the 18th, 19th, 20th century, where you've got these massive wars between conventional military forces. There still is asymmetric stuff going on, but it's less strategically significant. Where we are today in the world is a time where where asymmetry has moved from kind of the periphery of significance to the centerpiece. And of course, as we all know, what we're seeing today in the world are two separate but somewhat linked types of asymmetry. One is the asymmetry that's connected with the violent Islamic transnational network. That's a new type of insurgency. It's transnational rather than national. It's terrorism-centric rather than using terrorism and guerrilla war to prepare for conventional military victory. But it still is a type of insurgency. I mean, when the U.S. first began trying to figure out Al-Qaeda after 9/11, a then Australian military officer named David Kilcullen wrote a very important article saying, hey, you got to think of Al-Qaeda as running a transnational insurgency. They're using some of the same strategic methods that Mao or Ho Chi Minh or any other of the classic insurgents would use. So you do see this kind of new variation, sort of neo-insurgency, that's primarily focused or primarily used by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But the other type of asymmetry that we're seeing today are the things like what's called hybrid war that Russia is using to try to promote its interest. It's related to an idea that was explained by two Chinese colonels a couple of decades ago called unrestricted warfare. And basically what unrestricted or hybrid warfare means is to undergo conflict with an opponent, but to do it with no boundaries whatsoever. In other words, military action is not kind of limited off, but you use whatever method is available to you: informational, cyber, economic, ideological, anything. It truly is an unrestricted type of warfare that will exploit anything that can be exploited. And as you explore this, if you have the time, I would encourage you to go online and look for the Chinese report called On Unrestricted Warfare. It's probably not something it's a huge big thing that was done by two Chinese colonels, like I said, as part of their military education. Probably not going to want to read the whole thing, but it is worth at least getting a grasp of the concepts that were in there. When that first came out, I was telling someone earlier, I'm really bad about whenever I see a new book or document giving it what's called the Washington read, and that is you first go to the back to see if you're in the index or the And when I went to that one, I actually found myself in the citations, The problem was that in the English version of that, the Chinese colonels had transliterated my name into Chinese, and then when the U.S. Embassy translated it back, they didn't go look up the names, they just transliterated the transliteration, so nobody except me knows that it's actually me. But I am cited in that particular study. I think it's probably true today that unrestricted, that the Chinese officially have not totally adopted the sort of unrestricted warfare that the two colonels came out with, but the concepts, the ideas that they explained in that study are very worthwhile. And I think if you take a look at that, it will probably give you kind of an intellectual window into what Russia, that is the past master of unrestricted warfare today, is trying to do. I think if I look at these two types of asymmetry that are in the security environment today, the unrestricted warfare type and the neo-insurgency, I'm not sure that either of those is a strategy for decisive victory. Okay? If you go back and look at Mao's type of insurgency, as later utilized by the Vietnamese and other places, that was an asymmetric strategy that eventually could lead to what its proponents defined as decisive victory. The Chinese took over China, the Vietnamese took over Vietnam, so that really was a strategy for victory. But it was one that used asymmetry to prepare for conventional military victory. I mean, that's an important thing to keep in mind, that at least in the Chinese and Vietnamese cases, it was not guerrillas and terrorists that won. It was guerrillas and terrorists that undercut the power of the flawed, weak states they were facing in order to set the stage for conventional military victory. But if you look at the Al-Qaeda, ISIS type of neo-insurgency today, if you look at Russia's unrestricted warfare, I can't see a way that either of those are going to lead to outright victory. I mean, to me, it just simply doesn't make sense that Russia's going to reestablish the Soviet Union, or that ISIS or Al-Qaeda is going to actually establish and govern a caliphate. But what these types of asymmetry can do today is to undercut the decisiveness of conventional military. In other words, what they have done is to allow the U.S.'s preference for high-tech standoff military operations to be decisive. So this is an idea that I'm going to keep coming back to. Where we are today with today's asymmetry is a situation where it's very, very difficult to get rid of, to defeat, to abolish an opponent using asymmetric methods, but it's also very difficult or impossible for those entities using asymmetric methods to attain a decisive victory either. It is true today, though, that asymmetry remains a very serious dilemma for the United States in terms of its security. And I think that the simplest way to explain that is that asymmetry takes advantage of the peculiarity of the American strategic culture. I mean, for example, Americans are a chronically impatient people. I mean, everything we do. I mean, just the fact that we've got to constantly have the newest and latest. That we get interested in something and then we lose interest in it. I mean, we are a very restless and impatient people. That's difficult when you're dealing with an asymmetric enemy, particularly an enemy with an asymmetry of patience or an asymmetry of will. So what we see is that in some cases they simply outweight us. We may see that with the Taliban in Afghanistan. I mean, we have beaten the Taliban every military way possible, but there's a pretty good chance that 5-10 years from now, the U.S. will be out of Afghanistan and the Taliban will still be there. So America's impatience works against them. Another part of American strategic culture that hurts us in dealing with asymmetry is that Americans have a tough time dealing with ambiguity. I mean, we like to see the world as pitting good and bad. We like to see ourselves as a force for, look at the Navy recruiting commercials. I mean, just a perfect encapsulation of the American way of thinking. The Navy, a force for good. That's their recruiting slogan today. I mean, that's not just the Navy, that's the way the U.S., particularly the U.S. military, thinks of itself. Well, the problem is that asymmetric methods are much more ethically, legally, morally ambiguous. And the U.S. has a tough time dealing with that. You know, we certainly at a number of times throughout our history, probably too many times, have associated ourselves with evil, repressive partners. But we at least feel better when we do it. So whenever you have these kind of ethically ambiguous types of conflict, they make it difficult for the U.S. I mean, that was the great thing about Desert Storm in 1991, is Saddam Hussein was bad. We were a force for good. We went in and smashed his military. And that kind of was an unambiguous conflict. World War II, unambiguous. But today's conflicts, there is much greater ambiguity. And I think a third reason that asymmetry is a challenge for the United States is because of our complex, disjointed political organization. I mean, a good friend of mine, Dr. Retired Marine Colonel T.X. Campbell, who works at the National Defense University, wonderful guy, turning the phrase, often says, the American political system is one designed by geniuses to not work very effectively. I mean, it was designed to be, at least inefficient, if not ineffective. I mean, there was a reason the founding fathers did that. You make the government inefficient, and that way it's going to be harder for the government to oppress you. Okay, that made absolutely perfect sense in 1780. Still makes perfect sense today in terms of protecting domestic rights, but it certainly hurts us when dealing with asymmetric conflict. I mean, over and over again, we've talked about the problems that our political, our informational, our economic, our intelligence, our military parts of our strategy are at best loosely coordinated. So we simply are not set up to deal with kind of ambiguous asymmetric conflict. So we continue to have trouble with asymmetry. So we recognized in the 1990s it was going to be a problem. We thought a little bit about it, and it's kind of like, for 30 years now, we've had defense experts saying, this asymmetry stuff is going to become important. We have problems with it, but we have not, for a whole variety of reasons, been able to kind of really become effective at it. And I'm not sure we ever will. So that's kind of my quick history of asymmetry. Now let me kind of turn to the second of my issues, and that's kind of sketch a picture of the future security environment. As I mentioned, this is something I think a lot about, not only in writing the book that I shamelessly pumped at the beginning, I also write a weekly column for something called World Politics Review that's called Strategic Horizons, where I do a lot about thinking about kind of long-term future stuff. So, I mean, I could literally stay here for hours and hours and hours, if not days and days, and talk about, what I think about is happening in the future security environment, but don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a real tip of the waves picture. And I'm going to talk in particular about two of what futurists describe as mega trends in the world today that are having historic, profound effects in the global security environment, in the way that political organizations try to promote and sustain security, in the way they think about security, in the way they think about the role of force in creating and sustaining security. So we're really going to talk about two. And the one I'm going to start with is today's profusion of information. Okay. When I say that, I know that that probably invoke yawns because everybody has heard. I mean, we're all bombarded with this idea of the profusion of information that we all live with every day. We all thought about it. We all look at. I've got my Android here, and my iPhone, and my briefcase. I live this profusion of information every day. I mean, as a scholar, it just strikes me how when I started in the 1980s as a young scholar, the challenge was to find information. Now the problem is that you're just this avalanche, glacier of information, and the problem is picking which parts of it actually merit your attention, as opposed to all of the rest of it. And I remember, when I was a young scholar in the 1980s, I would spend an hour or two every day in the library. Now, I go to a library maybe 2 or 3 times a year because I can sit at my desk and do everything I need to do. So we all know about the profusion of information, but what I want to talk about here is just to suggest how I think it's specifically affecting security, the way people think about security, the way people create and try to sustain security. I think that one of the biggest, most important, most historic effects of the profusion of information today is the global erosion of authority structures of all kinds. Political, religious, idea shapers. I mean, every type of authority structure that has existed for decades or centuries is under assault in part because of this tidal wave of information. And I mean, one example of that I think, we can't pick up a newspaper without seeing today is the idea that the profusion of information has undercut the notion that some information is more authoritative, more valid than others. I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper, you can't turn on the television today without hearing somebody talk about the fact that we have entered what's called a post-truth time in history. Because people are able to select what information they're most comfortable with. They've reached this point where all information is kind of equally valid. Therefore, rather than saying, well, I don't really like that idea, but because it comes from an authoritative sort of a religious leader, political leader, a media source, or whatever, we can say, well, I don't like the New York Times take of this particular story, so I'll go to Breitbart and find one that I'm more comfortable with. The two are equal, so I'll just select the one I want. So we're at a point in history where people are selecting information not based on the authority of its source, but the degree to which it reflects their existing preferences and beliefs. And I mean, I can tell you, someone who, as I said, I'm a chronic tweeter. I have these discussions every day from someone going, well, X, and I go, but that's not true. And they go, but they say, but it's on this webpage, and of course we all know if it's on the internet, it must be true. So the idea that the profusion of information is decaying authority, the destruction of the political middle, the growth of ideological fragmentation, hyper-partisanship, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity is much more influential in the way the American public thinks about political events than is any given elected political official. And in part, this is because of the growth of information has allowed us to turn information into entertainment. I mean, we all know that a few decades ago, in the United States, most people got their information about world events, about political events, from either one of the 3 television networks or a few national media sources. One of the big newspapers, or the Associated Press, and your local newspaper, news magazines, Time, Newsweek, or whatever. And because there were so few of these organizations, and they wanted to appeal to a wide audience, and because they had information gatekeepers, they had editors and producers that actually decided whether something was valid enough to be presented as information, the tendency was toward moderation. I mean, while a lot of people say, oh, the networks and national media would, always had a liberal bias. I mean, I don't buy that. There was, there might have been a liberal leaning, but there was a push toward moderation. So if you were kind of, somebody that lived in a small town in the Midwest somewhere, you got your information about national politics, about the world, from watching, NBC, CBS, ABC, reading Time, Newsweek, reading AP stories, or whatever. And this led toward strengthening of the political middle. But today, someone living in a small town in the Midwest doesn't have to watch the networks. He or she can go to something that they find more ideologically compatible, and they can gather all of their information that way. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States today that do not consume any information from what many of us would consider an authoritative information source. A major newspaper, a cable network or something like that, but they gather their information purely from these kind of boutique sources that reflect their information. Okay. So what that means is this fragmentation and extremism in political attitudes. And I'll kind of circle back to this, but I think that's having a very profound impact on the way the U.S. thinks about security. And while I'm talking about the U.S. system here, I think the same thing is happening everywhere else. We talk about another way that the profusion of information is changing security. It's having a really, really big emerging impact on the nature of military operations. I mean, something I've been trying to tell the military leaders that I write for a number of years is I said, you gotta remember that from now forward, every military operation that you design and lead will be live cast. There will be people there with cell phones, and there will be a global audience watching your soldiers move down the street, watching your airplanes or your drones fly over. And that's a really historical, profound shift. Because throughout most of human history, most battles were kind of out of sight of most people. I mean, obviously the people in the local area, knew fighting was going on and saw the destruction and things like that. But if you were, go back, even in World War II, the Civil War, Napoleonic Wars, or whatever, if there was a major battle taking place and you were back at home, you wouldn't know about it for days, weeks, or whatever. Then you would read just a very particular picture written by journalists in many cases, but it was the picture that the military wanted you to have of this. So the government itself, political leaders, military leaders, to a large part shaped public perceptions on military operations. But today, the public can develop perception based on raw data. It's not data that's been shaped and formed by anyone in a position of authority, but they can actually watch what's going on. And that can be really, really shocking. I mean, think back a few years ago to the Chelsea Manning release of information from Iraq, and it was one little film clip that made the rounds a lot of a helicopter gunship shooting some people on the ground. This was, it was a normal thing that happened, hundreds of times a day in Iraq for years and years and years. But to a lot of the public that had never, heard the way the guys in the helicopters are talking while someone's dying on the ground, and you're watching it on video. That was a really profoundly shocking experience. And if anything, that's all going to expand, because almost anywhere that a military is going to operate, there's going to be people, or lots of people, with cell phones who are live streaming what's going on. So for the military, I think this is something that's really, really important. It's going to make it increasingly hard for governments of all kinds to sustain political support for military operations, because the public, you can make the argument this might be a good thing, but the public, for really the first time in history, is really going to understand what war is like up close and personal. It's not going to be something where, they see a few carefully cultivated pictures and a parade later on. They're really going to see what war is like. For a military leader, it's going to mean that indiscipline is very costly. If one of your soldiers messes up, and shoots a child walking across the square, in the past you could, with exception of things like May that where it eventually got out, generally you can keep things like that quiet. Now it's going to be everywhere on the internet initially. It's going to be very difficult for military leaders to to preserve what they call operational security. There may not ever be any more surprise attacks or surprise raids, or at least the surprise isn't going to last very long, because somebody is going to be live casting. And I don't think that military leaders in the U.S. or anywhere else have yet really come to grips with just what a big change it's going to be when the veil of secrecy is ripped off of military operations. But anyhow, with this information profusion in general, we're just at the beginning of the revolution. Like any revolution, when you're in the early stages, you don't know where it's going. The first year of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, no one would have predicted that it came out the way it did. No one knows where this particular information revolution is leading. But I would suggest that it's certainly fueling what I call a neo-nativism or boutique identities. We all know that in history, nation states became the most important form of political organization for two reasons. One was because that was the most effective size militarily. Kind of tries to tell the argument that nation states were it's kind of the Goldilocks principle. They weren't so big, they weren't too big, they weren't too little. They were the right size to be militarily effective. And at least during the industrial age, they also were economically effective. There were national economies that had the advantages of scale, but weren't so big that there couldn't be kind of a unitary economy. So nations arose for both military and economic reasons. The thing is, both of these may be fading away. We're seeing the privatization of military force. We're seeing the notion of super empowered small groups. It's just simply not certain that nation states will be the most effective military units in the future. But we're also seeing economic changes. I mean, with things like 3D printing, new energy sources, there are some futurists who are arguing that in the coming decades, it will be possible to have perfectly effective, prosperous, sustained microeconomies. I mean, 100 years ago, you couldn't do that because if you were like a little tiny principality, you were going to economically compete with Great Britain or Germany or the United States, you kind of got swamped because, industry required big amounts of, energy, raw materials, factories and stuff like that. But if we're moving to the point where you can have, a city-state that can make everything it wants, can generate its own energy, it has only a modest need for external resources, then the nation-state may end its reign as the most effective size economic unit. So where that might lead is that into an age where what we're going to see is more ideologically and culturally homogenous microstates along with transnational identities. The way I kind of think about this myself is if you think back to what life was like in Europe during feudalism, we had these kind of little microeconomies and microstates, but yet there still was to some degree, at least among the elite, there was this transnational identity of being part of Christendom or part of a kingdom or whatever. I think that may be the way the world's moving again. We have these microstates that are kind of ideologically, politically, culturally homogenous, but yet they still are viable economically, and they have some sort of transnational identity, but it's mostly limited to the elite. So if you think about it, that's a really, really different security environment than the nation-state industrial focused one that we've seen for at least the last couple of hundred years. The second mega trend I want to talk about is the emergence of new technologies. And the ones that I think are really important for security are autonomous system, robotics, that, as I indicated, I think are really is going to unleash a true revolution. I mean, I think the nature of military operations and armed conflict 20 or 30 years from now is going to be dramatically different as we see robot armies and swarms and things like that. New energy sources are going to change a lot of things in the world. It's going to make long distance trade in the Middle East and places like that less strategically significant. Virtual reality, miniaturization. I think we're entering a period in human history where it's going to be increasingly difficult to distinguish organic and non-organic things, the physical and the virtual. I mean, think about what that might mean for armed conflict and military operations. If you are a soldier and you don't know whether the person you're facing really is a person or an android, or a person or a virtual reality image. I think we're going to, within 50 years or something like that, we're going to be entering an era where cyborgs, these kind of blending of human and with non-human components, are going to be realistic. I mean, I tell you, the U.S. military and other militaries right now are very interested in what they call soldier enhancement technologies of all kinds. So sometimes these are things just like exoskeletons that soldiers wear, but they're also talking about things like being able to do things to make a soldier's brain different, doing various implants of various kinds to make them stronger, smarter, whatever. But we really are hitting this age where soldier enhancement, I think, is going to have just massive ethical and political implications. I think that we're probably not that far off from an era where we're going to see robot-on-robot conflict. Killer robots versus other kinds of robots. And what's going to happen when we reach that point is, while everyone says we're not going to have a robot making a kill decision, always going to be a human in the loop is the way the Department of Defense uses the phrase. The problem is, because of the speed of interaction, the points of human intervention in these various decisions are going to become rarer and rarer. In other words, robots can make decisions so fast, and humans can't make decisions as fast, then we're going to have to turn more and more of the decision making over to the machines. We're certainly going to see that in cyber warfare, because I mean today there simply is not time to say somebody call the president and tell him we're under cyber attack. And what that means is that anybody with money can buy it. I mean, for a long time, the U.S. was technologically superior to its enemies because we had big research labs and they didn't. But if somebody else has the money to buy the latest and greatest robotic or virtual reality from whoever's making it, then it's going to really change the nature of the security system. Nation states' advantage over big nation states' advantage is going to erode. I think we're also going to, within 40 or 50 years, reach a point in human history where a growing number of people will be economically superfluous as we move to more and more autonomous systems economically. And to me, this is a huge, huge thing, because we have developed these ideas for the past 400 or 500 years where a person's worth and identity are defined to a large part by their profession. You know, the whole Protestant ethic and all of this kind of stuff. Holding a job, working, was central to someone's value in society and to their own sense of self-worth. But what's going to happen 50 years from now when we reach a point where the United States or anyplace else can have a robust, prosperous economy with only 10% of the people needed to work, the rest of the work done by robots? You know, how are we going to reconfigure the way we think about human worth and human identity when most people simply won't need to work? So ethically, I think we're certainly moving toward a new world. Whether it'll be a brave one or not, I don't know. So anyhow, what does all this mean? Let me try to tie this together with the notion of asymmetry and the notion of megatrends and kind of rumble to a finish here so we can have a discussion. I made a list of what I think are the big implications that are obvious already. I mean, clearly, we don't really know what all of this means yet, and it very well may turn out to mean something very different than we think. But I think even at this point, when I go to the U.S. military and give them talks or write things, I say, one thing that I think is important is the U.S. military can no longer simply assume that it will have qualitative superiority over enemies that it faces. This has been an absolute bedrock of U.S. military strategy, at least since the 1950s. That not only our technology, but our people were better than theirs. They're better trained, better ethically, whatever. And that made military force politically usable for American political decision makers. But I think that as more and more ideas come from the private sector, I really think the U.S. military sometime within the next 5 or 10 years, somewhere is going to face an enemy that actually has some qualitative superiority over it. Maybe not across the board, but at least in some realm of technology, in some realm of training or whatever. I think that we've had kind of 60, maybe 75 years where we based everything that we thought on qualitative superiority. I think that's running out. Second, and I've kind of made this point a couple of times, I think that we can no longer assume on public support for any costly military operation. The idea of the Revolution of Military Affairs that I mentioned was to make political force usable. I think that string is running out as well. So future American political leaders may no longer be able to assume that public support will be created at all, much less last. We can't assume any even modicum of predictability or control in future uses of armed force in future military operations. I mean, the world is so interconnected today that everything has cascading, hard to predict effects. And this includes what the U.S. military calls the creation of a narrative. I mean, when the U.S. goes into Afghanistan and Iraq, or tries to create a narrative that justice can consolidate everyone. I mean, narratives today are simply impossible to control. Ideas come and go, you don't know where they came from, people aren't able to judge whether they're valid or not. So we are in this era where it's going to be very, very difficult to predict if I do in terms of the use of force in military operation, it's going to have an effect B. I think we certainly can't assume that security means national security anymore. As we move to this fragmented system, this neo-feudalism, I think that we may need to dramatically rethink that. I mean, there is a whole school of thought in both politics and academics about human security. I mean, that may be the way of the future, or it may be something else. I think we're reaching a period in time where most military action will be for retribution rather than conflict resolution. It will be an act of punishment. And we're already beginning to see that with the U.S.'s conflict with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and stuff like that. I don't think we have a strategy that will lead to any kind of decisive victory and resolution of the problem, but we have devolved to a strategy that basically says we will punish them for certain things. I think that we are moving to a point in human history where there will be less war in the traditional sense. State actions with discrete beginning and end, but endemic conflict. So less war in the traditional meaning of the word, more conflict. And what all this means is that the U.S. must dramatically rethink the way it thinks about security. There was a study released last week by something called the National Intelligence Council. The National Intelligence Council is kind of this overarching group in the U.S. intelligence community. And they have a strategic futures group that's tasked with looking deep into the future. Every 4 years, they publish a big report saying, this is what we expect to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. They just released one last week. It's online. I encourage you to look at it for someone that works in strategic futures. I published my World Politics Review column yesterday, which you can also find online, was about it. As I read that report last week, it's a 256-page report, so there's a lot of stuff in it, a lot of charts, demographics, climate change, all the stuff you would expect. But one word, it struck me that one word kept coming up over and over and over again in a number of different guises, and that was disruption. In this column I wrote yesterday, I actually made the argument that the U.S. intelligence community is making an argument that we are entering a period of human history I call the age of disruption. They were pointing out that because of all of these things I've talked about today, it's increasingly easy for individuals or small groups to disrupt economics, culture, societies, political systems. It's really, really difficult to establish and sustain order. So I think to disruption, I would add that the era we're in today is one of asymmetry, autonomy, and fragmentation. So the challenge then, given all of this, is to create a new rules-based, ethical, political, and legal frameworks to mitigate the dangers as much as possible. That is what I think is the challenge in the future. And I think that all of us, I mean, anyone who thinks deeply about these sorts of things has some role to play in this rebuilding of the frameworks to control conflict. So that's where we come in. So I think that all of us, anyone who writes, thinks, talks about these sorts of things, has a big job ahead of them as the world transitions to this age of disruption. But we have to do it because the stakes are immense.
Thank you, Dr. Metz, for this just illuminating but very disturbing. All right, I think you raised issues.
Just what's in my business card?
That will, I think, resonate throughout just about every talk that's going to happen for the next 2 days. And we do have time for questions, but I will let you handle them. All right?
Sure, okay, I'll start here and move around this way.
Thank you very, very much for kicking us off in this way. I'm just wondering about space and the asymmetries that are involved in space. Having been brought up in the artificial intelligence era, when we were talking about smart pebbles and all of that, the Star Wars era and all of that, are there some natural asymmetries in space missions that indeed set up another sort of asymmetry? I mean, some of the groups that we're talking about, ISIS, really are capable of sending missiles into space and all that. We're just seeing North Korea with renewed prospects for doing things with missiles. Now, again, can you just reflect on how space might evolve in terms of conflict? And I know that's another area in which autonomous systems might come into play, but the phone that you have is linked up to satellites, and if those satellites get knocked out of orbit, we're gone. We don't get our TV receptions, and I'll miss my movies tonight. So there you go.
You're exactly right that all of us, whether we know it or not, are utterly dependent on space systems. And I think space, while I didn't talk about it, really is a perfect illustration, I think, of some of the points I was trying to make, because it's one where traditionally there were two types of asymmetry. One was simply of capability and technology. The United States and Russia could do things that others could. But it also was one of ethical asymmetry. That the US, at least for a long time, said, well, we won't militarize space, but with any ethical asymmetry, one side can erode that. So if the other side says, well, we're going to militarize space, then there was a time where the US was powerful enough that we could say, okay, we're still not going to do it. But today, as you end up with a greater equality, if America's enemies do militarize space, the US is going to have to as well. But where space is also important is that's a perfect example, like robotics, where the true innovation capabilities are now coming from the private sector. So while it's true that for years we said, well, North Korea, Iran, whatever, can't develop anything like the space capability of the US. Well, it's not going to be that long to the point where the cutting edge space capabilities are not the US government, but are name a corporation. So then you have the whole question of, are these corporations that are transnational, might not have a national identity at all, are they going to basically sell payload to whoever can pay for it? So I think that a lot of people, while it's not an area I work in myself, there are a lot of people in the military futures thing that argue, the argument now that space is a new military domain. The military talks about domains of land, sea, air, human, won't get into that as a separate human domain, but now they're adding space as a fifth domain. My Twitter feed a few weeks ago, there's a whole bunch of tweets that were real cryptic about the fifth dimension. And I said, okay, you're talking about up and away the group. If they weren't, they were talking about space as a dimension of conflict. Kind of an interesting thing for somebody that thinks about armed conflict there is, if space does, well, when space blossoms as the fifth dimension, will the same sort of rule and logic that applies in the other domains apply as well? Particularly since it will be one where there won't be a lot of humans there kind of making it, like you said, it will be one where machines will be making decisions based on algorithms. So I think the space is an example of what I was trying to say. It's just one that I myself haven't done a lot.
Yeah, I liked your presentation. You began it by pointing out, noting the sophistication of military training and the level of education of military training and so on. But you ended it by pointing out that in the future we may find that others are qualitatively better trained. Can you explain that? Just elaborate that?
Sure.
Because we pour funding and education and resources and so on into training the U.S. military. So why would you think that others would?
Well, there's kind of two dimensions to that. One is that part of the human qualitative advantage the U.S. military had was not just the schoolroom education, but was the type of training that we did. We have stuff like the National Training Center, this really realistic training. I was part of a research team that went to Iraq in April and May of 2003, so right at the end of the conventional war, to kind of walk the various places where there had been battlefield engagements and try to figure out why things came out the way they did. And in almost every engagement, of course, where there was engagement between the U.S. and Iraqi forces, the U.S. had great advantage. And what my team found, kind of to their surprise, is that technology didn't really fully account for that. There were a number of engagements where we went out and walked around and had the people that were in the battlefield explain it to us. And the Iraqis had T-72 tanks. They had as good a technology. They were actually in a better position than we were. They laid in ambush or whatever. But yet, invariably, they got just slaughtered. And what we concluded was that the best explanation for the way those engagements came out was not technology, but was the quality of training and leadership that our people had. So that's part of it. But I think the threat is that even this particular advantage is going to be disintegrating because adversaries will have ways of educating themselves other than going and setting up staff in war college. I mean, the U.S. military is having a big debate right now as to whether we still need to have staff in war colleges, people come to the classroom for 10 months, or can it all be done distributed? Can it all be done, online? I mean, right now we're still debating this over, what are the advantages of second in classroom, which has some advantages, but it's really, really expensive, versus having everybody kind of set up their computer and do stuff like this. I think that as we see virtual reality emerge in the private sector, the qualitative advantage that the U.S. gets from training and education is going to erode somewhat. I mean, the U.S. military is already looking at this idea that rather than spend literally millions of dollars to send a battalion out to Fort Irving, California, and have them do a real live fake battle, that you can put people in simulators where it's becoming harder and harder to tell whether you're in a simulator or you're actually setting the vehicle in Fort Irving. Well, that's good for us to do that because it saves U.S. taxpayer money, but it also means that other people can kind of do the same thing. I heard another kind of anecdote along those lines. I have heard rumors, I don't know if it's this, but I've heard rumors that the parts of the U.S. military that are interested in innovation have become really big users of things like Second Life and these online virtual realities, because they kind of crowdsource problems. They go and say, oh, if you were going to defeat the U.S., in Second Life, how would you do it? People, gamers kind of all jump in and provide ideas. 90% of the ideas are irrelevant. But we're crowdsourcing creativity and thinking at the same time. Well, it's good that we're doing that, but if we can do that, other people can as well. So I have no doubt that there are North Koreans and Iranians and Russians in Second Life and the gamer community saying, yeah, how would you defeat the U.S.? And kind of weeding through that idea. So I guess what I'm saying is that at least I see the trends as making the U.S. advance. I mean, we had kind of industrial education where bigger was better. If you spent more money on the school, you had better quality education. But I think that as we're seeing dispersion of information, that advantage is probably going to decline. Back then?
Yeah, two questions. First of all, how do you see asymmetry being manifested in doctrine and in force structure? And what is your critique of it? Because I could argue that JSOC is probably a manifestation of these kind of trends, yet we see problems with JSOC, because JSOC becomes sort of the let's do it all type of military instrumentation in the present world. And secondly, the whole term asymmetry. It's my understanding that this term evolved from a World Politics article in the 70s. Somebody decided to call the Vietnam War asymmetrical. And you know that before that, there was a huge debate in the 60s, is it Revolutionary War, counter-revolutionary war, Volkoismo, People's War, etc. And the point is that asymmetry tends to obfuscate, in looking at these complicated situations in the third world, the political, social, economic, military interactions from the grassroots up in these conflicts, to the point that perhaps it can be a terminology that is confusing rather than clarifying. And I'm just wondering what your take on it, because I've heard this argument from others.
Yeah, well, let me kind of explain the backstory of the question there for people who kind of aren't looking from inside the U.S. military. JSOC is Joint Special Operations Command. As you probably know, the U.S. military for a long time is, in addition to its conventional forces, has had what they call special forces. I mean, all of the services had. In the Army, it was the Green Berets, there was special forces brand. Today, the correct phrase is SOF, SOS, Special Operations Force, Navy, SEALs, Air Force, Special Warfare Unit. This was always in the military, but yet their whole way of what they did and what they thought about the way they fought was different than the big units. I mean, in the Army that I'm most familiar with, what we call big Army would be, battalions and brigades, guys driving in tanks, thousands of guys maneuvering around on the battlefield, while the Special Forces would be what we call 18 detachments, just a small handful of guys who would be out living with foreigners. They all had kind of cultural training, language training, and stuff like that. What the question alludes to is during the struggle with this asymmetric opponent of violent Islamic extremism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and whatever, we've seen SOF within the U.S. military, the Special Operations Forces, go from kind of the periphery to darn close to the middle. We've had, soft is much, much more important to the U.S. military and U.S. military strategy in the United States today than it was 20 years ago. And I mean, a perfect example of that is the creation of this Joint Special Operations Command that coordinates all these special operations units. There was the creation a number of years ago of something called the Special Operations Command. It's this big 4-star headquarters to deal with all of this stuff. So I mean, he's exactly right that part of the U.S. military's response to the increasing strategic significance of asymmetry was to elevate the importance of the Special Operations Command. Kind of the questions the military are grappling with today is, first of all, how far can you go with that? It's really, really hard and expensive to train a special operator. They have such special skill sets. They are just unbelievably trained, not only in what they do militarily, but also, if they're Army Special Forces guys, in language and culture and stuff like that. You can't just take a 19-year-old who signs up at your recruiting center and turn them into a special operator. It takes 8-10 years before you can get them to that point. So the military is saying, okay, given that soft is more important, how much can we make the military into soft? How can we use these soft guys that we've got at the intensity we're using them today without wearing them off? And I mean, I can tell you, if you know anybody who's like a Navy SEAL, and Army Special Forces guys, these guys are deployed over and over and over again, and they're just kind of like physically, emotionally, family-wise, personally kind of beat to death just because they've been so busy for the past 15 or 20 years. So that's kind of one of the big questions. Another kind of big question from a political perspective is, if we have this soft and drone-centric strategy, is that really a strategy for victory over ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or is it a way of kind of conflict containment, conflict management? I'll tell you my own perspective on that. I believe we need to stop conceptualizing the conflict with ISIS and Al-Qaeda as a war that's going to somehow have some sort of militarily decisive outcome. And we need to just admit to ourselves that it's conflict management. I mean, while this is, I don't know if this falls in the category of politically incorrect, but I say what we need to do is go back and look at the ways empires throughout history managed the barbarians. Because most empires had to manage the barbarians, the broker one way or the other. And that's kind of what the U.S. is doing today. We need to stop thinking like Americans, where a war starts, you go out, you reach military victory, you have a parade, everybody comes home and the war's over. And that's the way Americans think about strategic history. That's not the history we want, but we haven't gotten it. In terms of it obfuscating more than enlightening, I guess I would say there is the risk of that. I mean, there were people, particularly in the 1990s, that said, "Oh, geez, if we talk about asymmetry, then all of a sudden there's this like epiphany, and everybody understands everything." And you're right that there, with any different way of phrasing things, there is the risk of obfuscation. It depends on how you use the word. I mean, I find some utility in the word to the degree that it makes us think differently about a problem set than we might have otherwise. It's certainly not a panacea. It's not like, well, if we can just grasp asymmetry, then kind of problem solved. But to the extent that it's kind of a portal into a different way of thinking about security, thinking about the role of military force, I think there is some utility. Just don't expect too much.
Yeah, but, okay, talk later.
Okay, I kind of got two questions, and you got into one in a lot of ways. Empire versus barbarians. And with all these emerging new events that you documented precisely, doesn't it look a lot like the end of Rome and the rise of the barbarians, the end of the British/American Empire, and the emergence of many centers of power worldwide and fractionalization of all kinds of societies? I mean, we've seen the blow up of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and that may be just the beginning. Brexit could be the beginning of the Europe situation as well. Some people in Europe think that America is going to divide up. I don't think Americans think that, but We certainly have some
Well,
very
people in
divisive
Texas do.
divisive. Well, I'd like to see them secede. But yeah, and I'd like to see California secede, I suppose. But so there's that. Are we at that stage where, like the end of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages, you already described some effects exactly like that. The rise of feudalism and multicentricism. And the second question is Joshua Goldstein's 500-year study of European wars, and my adding Roman and American wars to it. I find that of 17 major war events due for the 2020s, 6 of them are 2025. So who's the war going to be with? Who's going to be involved? Usually the number 1 or 2 or 3 economic powers, like in World War I, which kind of suggests China, Japan, U.S. is maybe a central focus of that. And will it happen? 54 years ago, the Sino-Soviet thing didn't happen because of Soviet Union, because of nuclear weapons, although in 1969 they had border clashes, and it could have been a major war at that point in time. So that's the other thing. What do you see in 10 years out, if there were a major conflict, where do you see it would be, and how do you think it would unfold, or would it be mitigated by other circumstances arising in our day and time? And then are we at the end of empire and emergence of a new phase of civilization?
Yeah, the end of the existing order is, and it really resonates with me for a number of reasons. One is, for the past couple of months, for rather obvious reasons, I found it difficult to read the news. I needed a way to keep my brain busy. What I did was discovered the novels of Harry Sidebottom. Is anybody familiar with him? Harry Sidebottom is a classicist at Oxford or Cambridge, but he's written a whole series of novels that are set in Rome in the 3rd century AD. And they're really, really wonderful because the guy, he really knows intimate detail. So it's one of these, you're kind of there. And I think I've read 7 of those novels since November. He picked the 3rd century as a particularly interesting time because it was a time where there was this kind of general sense that things were beginning to fall apart. The idea he uses, and I assume he actually derived this from Roman history, was it was described as an era of iron and rust. So it wasn't yet all rust the way it was by the 4th or 5th century, but it was no longer iron the way it was in the 1st or 2nd century. So I think that that may be where we are in terms of this particular liberal world order. And I would point out that that National Intelligence Council study that was released last week, they also made that point. They also just came right out and said, listen, the post-World War II, nation-state, U.S.-dominated, engineered liberal world order, we can kind of see is decaying, if not yet at an end, but we don't know what comes afterwards. In terms of large-scale wars, that's actually interesting. My institute has a number of studies underway, not looking at whether there will be large-scale wars, but whether, if there was one, whether the U.S. can still fight a big war or not. I wrote an essay on that a couple of years ago, pointing out that we may have reached a point where, for economic reasons, political reasons, or whatever, it's not even clear that we could. But I think you're exactly right that historians and political scientists have pointed out that there have been times in history in the past where large war between the great powers went away for a while, that at least so far it has always come back. So I think within the U.S. military, the idea is while we don't see war with China as imminent or maybe even likely, it also would be a mistake to say big, large-scale war between nations is gone forever. And it very well may be, if you buy my notion that of a lot of other futures, that we're seeing kind of the gradual decline of the nation state as the primary economic, political, military unit. It very well may be that in an attempt to save their importance, that nations try to return to conventional war making. I mean, to basically nation states show that they still are important by going to war with another nation state. So I mean, I think I would agree that we can't say that large-scale war between nations is gone forever, but I also don't see it the only one that I think is possible to highly possible in the next 5 to 10 years would be something involving North Korea. I mean, I find North Korea by far the scariest security scenario on Earth. I mean, I keep writing my column that we got to get over this obsession with ISIS, because I mean, ISIS is really, really nasty. We need to keep smacking it. But you know, compared to the threat from North Korea, not even instantly. So I could see North Korea kind of thrashing out as it begins, as the dynasty there begins to collapse. So you know, I would say no big war on the horizon. It's,
Could be a small, could be South China Sea naval like 1588 Spanish Armada.
Could we move forward?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
You've been waiting, but yes, Marcia.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I wanted to pick up on your note on the end of the narrative. I think we are certainly at the end of a small number of sources of information. It's not clear to me we're at the end of the narratives. And I'd like to suggest that powerful entities seem to be able to configure large amounts of information according to very deep cultural narratives. So powerful, in fact, that they might override what we might call facts in these large sources of information, facts about trade, automation, technology, immigration, walls with Mexico, and so on. So I'm thinking Trump was elected on a powerful narrative. Brexit, a different but related narrative. The Polish vote, yet a different, again, narrative. The Hungarian right. ISIS has a narrative. Hindu nationalism has, I'm trying to, the rise of global Pentecostalism, another powerful narrative. Podemos on the left in Europe. All of these are powerful narratives configuring large numbers of information pieces. So it's not clear to me we're at the end of narrative.
Yeah, if that's the way I phrase it, I'll make a mistake, because I didn't think we were at the end of narrative. What I was trying to suggest is that we are at the end of authoritative, controlled, and managed narratives. Maybe a way to think about it metaphorically is I think that you know, if narratives were music, we're seeing the transition from classical to jazz. You know, where in classical, where you've got every note by every player kind of written, and you know, a conductor centrally controlling it, to jazz, where you have kind of a common theme and people riff on it. So I think you're exactly right that narratives as an organizer of human life and as a power in driving history are never going to go. I mean, it's just part of what being human is. But the idea that there can be an authoritatively designed, and where I had that argument with my colleagues in the military is for years and years people argued that we're losing the battle of the narratives because we're not properly organized. You know, if we just had some sort of, you know, department of narrative where, you know, everybody says, okay, go get the narrative is bullet A, B, and C. Now everybody go out and say this, and I keep going, no, that's not, you know, organization is not the issue. It's not understanding how narratives work.
Actually, we have a department of narrative. It's called culture. And I think you have lack of authoritative institutions. We need to distinguish between institutions and deep-seated narratives that are there through multiple institutions.
We're nearing the end of our questioning session. We have a break and prepare for the next one. So I'll just pick a couple, quick questions. Please keep them pointed and direct. All right. Russell?
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. The way I hear you, it's purely about the U.S. military trying to figure out how to respond to asymmetry in particular. I'm interested in the hybrid side, so the Russia side. Do you see the U.S. military considering, prepared, should it engage in this hybrid warfare actively rather than just respond? That is, Could we do the green men strategy? Could we do electoral intrusion? Could we operate with fake news on their battlefield?
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue. You know, I mean, there's a lot of frustration on the military's part because what Russia has done is to shift decisiveness out of the military realm into other realms. And so the people in the U.S. military are going to respond to this. We need to like revive the U.S. information agency. In other words, the military says, yeah, we need to do something about this, but we're not the ones, you know, to do that. I know there are also a number of people that have pointed out that that in terms of what Russia apparently is doing to us, we've been doing to other nations for 50 or 60, you know, intervention in elections and planting ideas and things like that. So there are people, you know, particularly my Twitter feed, who are kind of struck at the irony that it's that you know what we have done for a long time. So I mean, I think within the U.S. government there are people who are thinking about how we might best respond to this. But the problem is that, you know, not only the way our government is organized, but the moral restraints are different as well. So I guess that's what you've identified is a very important question, but one that I haven't seen anybody that has a slice on what the answer is. I think that's something that the U.S. government in general and security experts in general are going to be mulling over for years and years and years.
It's hard to say. George?
My question is, in this new age, what is the role of traditional or new international law? What is the future of international law the way we understand it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer to that would be that perhaps what we need in the future is to transcend the concept of international law that was based on a nation-state boundary system, and we need some sort of, you know, something else. I don't know if you call it transnational law or something like that. Of course, the problem is that law tends to flow from authority. If you buy the notion that authority is degrading, then, you know, can you have law without authority? I think is kind of the big question there. But I mean, I think it's certainly, I'm somebody that, like, when I was at university, I wrote my master's thesis on international law, and I taught international law in the undergraduate level. So I was always kind of interested in it. I've been kind of struck at how even discussion of it has declined in the U.S. lately. Just, you know, to give you one example of that. You know, I've been involved a number of times over the last 4 or 5 years in the whole debate over whether the United States should strike Iranian nuclear facilities. And I always go back and say any president, U.S. president that orders that has clearly, beyond a question, violated international law. And our Constitution says international law is part of the law of the land, so this president is now a criminal. And I made that argument to really smart people in Washington think tanks, and it's like nobody even bothers to reply to me. It's just, I think that I'm seeing less concern for international law now, at least from where I am, than I've seen throughout my entire career. So, you know, what I ended with was this notion that we desperately need some sort of new rules-based system. But the question is, how can you have rules if you have degrading structures?
One more question.
So where we are today and where you see us going, what has happened to the counterinsurgency doctrines for the last 15 years that, to me, from a layman's perspective, seem like a revolution in itself? David Petraeus, the U.S. Army Field Manual, that revolution, which, even though it was about countering insurgency as a form of asymmetric warfare, at least it was positive, I think, on the idea that there could be a conventional end to that conflict. There could be a victory in that conflict. In Afghanistan, there's still a massive Taliban insurgency, which seems to be doing quite well, for example.
You know, think about how to play, because I could very easily give a 3-hour answer to that, because it's kind of whatever. But let me do this wrong. In terms of the counterinsurgency doctrine, it continues to evolve. There is both joint and army doctrine. I mean, ever since the Petraeus Field Manual 3-24, there is another iteration past that. And while I was at the workshop, that actually Petraeus, well, it never happened. When he first talked about writing that new manual, was at a meeting at the Brookings Institution, and he said, "Oh, and John Nagel and Steve Metz are going to be the authors of that." I was sitting next to John Nagel and looked at him and said, "Did you know anything about this?" I said, "News to me." I was involved, but wasn't the primary. So doctrine has continued to evolve, which is a good thing, because what happened in the 1980s and 90s was, once the Cold War was over, we just stopped thinking about it. We stopped writing. I mean, nobody had thought about insurgency for 10 or 20 years. The flaw with counterinsurgency doctrine was that I think the U.S. military understood counterinsurgency pretty well in terms of what the military is supposed to be. The conundrum was the solution to insurgency is not military, it's political. And what we never had was political solutions. And kind of, you know, what I call as the great dilemma of insurgency is the more the military situation in insurgency gets under control, the less a partner nation, less leverage we have over them. And what the U.S. was asking partners like the Afghan government, the Iraqi government to do was to totally change a system that had personally benefited the elites that were running that system. And so what they would tend to do was to kind of get the military part under control and say, okay, no more reform, you know, problem solved. And then the problem would come back, you would have a resurgence. So I don't think I think the U.S. military got really, really good at its part of counterinsurgency, but we never really cracked the part of how do you make partner governments totally change a political system that allowed them to send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland and get really rich.
You've got many more questions, I see. I'm sorry we can't get to them, but I'm sure Dr. Metz will talk to you at the breaks throughout the conference. And once again, I want to thank you for the questions.